Now let's welcome our last speaker before lunch, Dr. Mark Fuhrmann. Mark is a geochemist at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, where he has worked for the last 11 years. Prior to that, he was a researcher at the Brookhaven National Lab for 26 years, so lots of experience. He holds a PhD from the State University of New York at Stony Brook.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a brief overview of some of the work that we've done for a project we call the Radon Barriers Project, and ultimately try to answer the question, do properties of radon barriers change over time? This was an NRC and DOE-LM collaboration. In fact, DOE-LM put in probably most of the funds. I don't know how much, but I'm sure it was most of it. But we assembled a pretty nice team with Craig Benson as the lead, Jody Waugh doing work for DOE. Morgan Williams is a soils guy at Berkeley. And I'm the geochemist on the project and also the project manager. So this worked out kind of nicely. I got to go out in the field and do stuff instead of being stuck in the office. So these are covers over uranium mill tailing wastes that we were discussing here. There are about 50 sites in the U.S. There are actually more of them, but a lot of them, the waste was accumulated into about 50 sites. So each site contains large volumes of waste from uranium ore processing. Primary concerns are for radionuclides, it's radium-226 and its daughters, particularly radon-222. But there are other contaminants as well. Molybdenum, selenium, and vanadium are very common in uranium ores. There are pH issues, as you would expect. And the idea is that there are a number of different modes of potential exposure. There was wind scattering of contaminated fines over pretty large areas around some of these sites. So that material was accumulated. There are groundwater issues, of course. And then a lot of the contaminated material, for at least for some time, was exposed and even allowed to be used by people in the community as backfill for driveways, aggregate and concrete, bedding for roadways in towns. And so a lot of that material is even now still being accumulated and put into some of these sites. So anyway, the solution is to gather this waste and cover it with earthen barriers so it's sequestered. Now, these are pretty simple barriers. They are covered by the Uranium Mill Tailings Radiation Control Act of 1978. There are a few criteria, particularly radon flux of 20 picocuries per meter square per second. There's discussion about water percolation through the waste, of course. The time frame for this, as established in UMTRCA, is 1,000 years as practicable, but no less than 200 years. I'm not sure exactly what that means. We'll have to go back to Congress in 200 years and see what they meant, I guess. But we're certainly looking at relatively long times here. So the challenge is that these sites were built to certain criteria, and some engineering property will be down here, the as-built property. And Craig Benson and Jody Waugh and Bill Albright in particular, and others, did a lot of work looking at sites, covers on a number of different types of sites throughout the country. I think they did 27 different examinations in this particular project, where they found that even in between 8 and 10 years of age, covers began to show changes in their properties. So the Radon Barriers Project pushes this out a little bit in time. The covers that we looked at are between 20 and 25 years old. But none of these that were done earlier were on uranium mill tailings, so that's what we focused here. And we looked at 4 sites. So the question is, okay, we're out here at 25 years. What's the situation going to be like at 1,000 years or even 200 years? So the approach that we're taking is to look at both changes from the as-built condition if we can, and also to think about what the conditions are in the sites that we call analog sites. These are the sites that the material for the covers were actually built from. So these are right nearby the disposal site. Maybe a mile or so away, the material was brought over to the disposal site to make the cover. And sometimes in these areas you can find relatively, well, or almost completely undisturbed material that's been lying there for thousands of years. We go and sample that and do analysis on that to get an idea of if this curve is true, then where along this line is the analog site, and if we expect the cover to get to there, then what kind of position does that put us in? So the purpose of the project was have the properties of radon barriers over mill-tilling sites changed over time. And what we want to do is compare these properties to the as-built cover if we can, and then also compare them to the original material, the borrow material. I don't know why it's called borrow, because nobody's going to put it back, but the borrow material, and these are our natural analogs. Our primary concerns are radon flux and hydraulic conductivity. These are controlled by soil structure and by moisture content, density, and distribution of roots. So regarding the as-built cover, we have good data on radon fluxes from just after the cover was built. Surveys were done on each of them, typically with at least 100 samples on a grid pattern. Hydraulic conductivity typically wasn't done, but there's data there that would allow us to calculate it. Moisture content and density were measured routinely as the covers were built. Sometimes thousands of data points were available for that. So what does this tell us about the evolution of covers? Well, I'm going to concentrate mostly on two of the four sites that we looked at. One is the Falls City site. And I guess actually one of the earlier slides disappeared because I had a slide showing the four sites. So there were Falls City, which is in Texas, Blue Water in New Mexico, the Shirley Basin south in Wyoming, and then Lakeview in Oregon. Two of those sites had vegetated covers, and two of them are rock-covered covers. Originally, Lakeview also had soil added subsequently. But here's the Falls City site. And this is kind of a long-distance view of it. It sits about 60 feet over grade. The top is vegetated. It has this riprap side slope. And what the top of the cover looks like, you have the tailings down the bottom, and then lower activity waste piled on top of that. Then the radon barrier, then some growth medium, and then topsoil and for the growth of plants. So there's about 3 feet of radon barrier and about 3 feet of other protective material on top of that. This is the Blue Water site in New Mexico. It's a lot bigger. It's all riprap covered. Main cell has 16 million cubic yards of waste in it. So here's thousands of acres at the site. This is a very different type of cover. You can see it's all riprap. So the radon barrier itself, then some bedding, and then a relatively thin layer of riprap. And you can see that plants, in fact, do establish themselves on this cover. There are areas of the site where there are actually more vegetation. Periodically, those are sprayed with herbicides, but nevertheless, you do get vegetation established, oftentimes from wind-blown dust that accumulates in the riprap, so that you've got fines that allow the plants to take root, and then they can send roots down. So these are the two sites I'll concentrate on mostly. So what we did was went out to these sites, and we excavated down at a number of locations at each site. You can see This is a bedding layer here, this topsoil, and he's standing on the top of the radon barrier itself. So we excavated down to the radon barrier, and this took a lot of documentation and planning and approvals, as you might imagine. And then we did radon flux measurements at the top of the barrier. And so these are all different size flux chambers. This is the largest ones, and this is the smallest one here. So we had 4 different sizes. Radon concentrations were measured with these RAD7 devices, which gave us almost real-time information on concentration of radon, actually daughters of the radon that were accumulating in these chambers. This guy back here is doing a in-the-field hydraulic conductivity measurement, although most of ours were done in the lab. So each pit is a few meters square, and we did a number of measurements in each one to try to give us an idea of variability within those pits just over a short distance. Then what we would do is dig down. So this is the top of the radon barrier, dig down to the bottom of the radon barrier, take a lot of samples in between, do flux measurement at the bottom to give us a source term. And so that's what you see here for one of the sites. So this is a measurement from one of the chambers at the top of the barrier. So we're looking at, this is for concentration. It got converted to flux later. This is in becquerels per cubic meter. And we see about 20,000, 25,000 becquerels per cubic meter. If you look at the source term, that goes a lot higher, a lot faster. This one is 75,000. It actually, measurements continued, and it goes considerably higher than that. The highest ones we saw were about 5 million becquerels per cubic meter, which is pretty feisty. To put it in context, the EPA limit for residences, or the guidance and what you can tolerate in your basement, is 4 picocuries per liter or 150 becquerels per cubic meter, so that's way down there somewhere. One of the sidelights of spending a couple of years doing this work is I finally tested my basement and found out I had to remediate it. It figures, right? I think it was only about 12 picocuries per liter. Anyway, so at each site we did a lot of different tests, in situ measurements and observations, as well as taking samples for the lab, taking core samples here. These are the samples that were taken for hydraulic conductivity. Some of Craig Benson's work showed that you really need like a 30 centimeter diameter sample in order to get good representative information on hydraulic conductivity. So that's what we did, and these are tough to get. Some of these materials on these covers have essentially baked themselves to a brick-like quality, and it takes any number of graduate students and a couple of old senior guys to really sweat over getting these things out. This is what one looks like when it's packed up for shipping, and we did many, many of these. The soil science guy did a bunch of analyses. I get to go out there and get samples for lead-210, which is sort of my pet part of this project, but lots of analyses were done. Everything from our bulk density and moisture, root counts, nematode counts, all sorts of things. And in fact, to focus on the soil science part of it, this fellow from Berkeley has looked at soil structure, size, and grade of structures that he observed, root morphology, looking at the size and quantity at different depths. Quite surprising how far very thin little roots can grow. Lots of soil chemistry, a lot more than is shown here. Soil biology, nematodes, which are, to him, indicators of what's going on in the subsurface. Nematodes are small, round worms. Many of them are microscopic. And also did work with bacteria counts, that sort of thing. So there's a tremendous amount of data there. To give you just a really quick view of the sorts of things that you could observe is that this is a cross-section from the Falls City site. So here's the topsoil, here's the vegetation growing on the top there. And that, by the way, at Falls City, that grass is actually mowed and used for hay. So here's the topsoil. This is the bedding material. This is the radon barrier itself. This is the same stuff, came from the same borrow area. But this was compacted, the moisture was adjusted to get optimum compaction, and then this was the same material just laid in with much less strict controls over it. So you can see there's actually quite a substantial difference in the texture between this material and here, just because of that compaction that was done like 22 years ago. So these are radon flux measurements from the Falls City site that we did. So we did 6 cells on the site. These are on the side slope with the rock covers. These are on the vegetated top. Pretty obvious difference here. Oh, this is the average of the as-builts, and this is background. The background is based on the radium-226 content of the barrier material itself. So the background's pretty low. These two on the side slope are practically background, but they're covered by that riprap, which keeps them moist. These cells are on the top slope. The vegetation removes the moisture, and so you end up then with substantially higher fluxes, partly because of the vegetation is removing the moisture, and also possibly because of the pathways that roots are providing as well, although we didn't see roots getting down very far through the radon barrier at this site. So you see that there's a big difference in radon fluxes, wet samples, dry samples. So that obviously keeping a site, the barrier damp is a big advantage for radon flux. So here we did have good data for Falls City on the as-built, and so we could do a histogram of that. So that's what the blue is the as-built measurements. So this is frequency versus radon flux. And there is a shift here in the scale at 0.1, so this actually really would extend way out over by the wall there. But what we see is that some of our samples, and admittedly we sampled in a biased sort of way. We were looking for areas around plants and in areas that we thought might be higher fluxes, and this was done on a grid. But the point remains that we've got a number of samples that are way beyond any that were observed from the as-built sampling. So that's very suggestive that we've got some kind of changes going on with the fluxes. Now we have more data than this. This is for saturated hydraulic conductivity from those big samples. We have more data than this coming in. Actually, I guess it is in. It just didn't make it onto this slide. The red points are hydraulic conductivity. This is depth here in meters below ground surface, and this is conductivity. So these two are actually from the side slope, and these two are from the top. The black ones are from the analog site where that cover material came from. So they're pretty consistent with depth. And they're also showing that hydraulic conductivity is relatively high here, between 10 to the minus 6, 10 to the minus 5. What we see then is a gradient of our measured conductivities where at the surface or near the surface of the cover, it looks like we're reverting back to a conductivity pretty much like the analog. The interesting thing about this is that these two are from the side slope. They're the wet ones that had really good properties regarding radon flux. This is suggestive that, yeah, but you could have transport of water through them, right? So there's a trade-off, between minimizing radon flux and minimizing water flow through the system. So here's some radon flux measurements from the top of the radon barrier at the Blue Water site. So you can see obvious major differences in these fluxes. Here's the average of the as-built. These are backgrounds calculated different ways. Pit 4 and Pit 5 were a pair pretty close to each other, within 10, 20 meters of each other. Pit 4 had very sparse vegetation, very low radon fluxes. And Pit 5 had a saltbush complex growing on it. Obvious real pathways for radon, both from drying out the barrier around that bush over a fairly large radius. And we have data to kind of explore what that radius looks like, as well as pathways from old roots or even roots that have shrunk during drying conditions. The point is you get much higher fluxes around a large bush like that. And in fact, some of these are, the criterion in the 20 picocurie criterion is actually 0.74 becquerels. So that's about here. So, yeah, we have a few that exceed the criterion. That's not a big deal. It's based, the criterion is based on an average of the whole site. It's not a big deal that a few are exceeding it. But it is pointing to processes that are leading to degradation of that cover when you've got nearby site that's pretty good shape, and then this other one that has really high fluxes. Another interesting thing, it was a very active ant mound right nearby, and you can see the fluxes from that are pretty elevated as well. So again, we can look at a comparison of the as-builts to this work, and we see the same kind of thing. Out here, we have a few samples now that far exceed any of the fluxes observed during the original as-builts. Well, that makes a lot of sense. There are plants growing on this thing now. Around those plants, we have these high fluxes. Back when it was built, you don't have those. But this is giving us an indicator of where this is going to go, potentially. One of the things that we're doing with this is because we've got top and bottom fluxes from above and below the barrier, we know the thickness of the barrier, we can calculate diffusion coefficients, and that can give us travel times through the barrier, assuming diffusion as a mechanism. And this kind of gives us some perspective. The radon 222 has a 3.8-day half-life, so within about 30, 35 days, you would expect it to be gone. Right? It's all decayed away. So we have a couple of sites where we're looking at about three half-life travel times. Other locations where we're looking at 40 or 80 half-life travel times. So this is kind of a good indicator of how effective that barrier can be at different locations, and quite a bit of variation. So here's some data for saturated hydraulic conductivity for the Blue Water site. Again, here are the analogs, amazingly consistent, in fact. And a number of measurements really indicate that as a function of depth, we have changes occurring in the saturated hydraulic conductivity such that at shallower depth there's a lot greater change. These are calculated hydraulic conductivities based on the properties of the material as it was in the original cover. So we expect that, so these are pretty representative of what they should have been or were, and here we see substantial changes by over an order of magnitude, 2 orders of magnitude really. Okay, so this is my favorite part. As a result, this isn't data from Falls City or Blue Water, it's from Shirley Basin because that's the most fun. So this is the Shirley Basin site, it's in Wyoming. And what we did was we took samples for lead-210. Now, So lead-210 is a long-term, long half-life daughter of radon-222. So it's going to accumulate for years and years and years after the radon has gone. So it's a good indicator of where in the barrier that radon has decayed. And what we really would like is a good indicator of just that. What are these profiles? Where is the radon? How far is it moving through the barrier? Where is it decaying? What's controlling that? You know, the flux measurements don't tell us much. Those are 24-hour measurements. So they're very short. They're subject to meteorological influences as well. So we think that maybe lead-210 might be a very useful indicator. The sites were designed with the assumption that diffusion is controlling radon transport through them. It's a good assumption. So their thicknesses of these barrier materials was designed based on that modeling. And sometimes that's what you see. This actually fits a pretty nice diffusion curve. This is the background. This is detection limit. This is the background of the material. And in this case, what we see is that by about 25 centimeters above the waist is down here. At about 25 centimeters, the radon, though the lead-210 rather, has essentially gotten down to background, suggesting that the radon is not getting past that point. And in fact, we see that here. When that's the case, our measured fluxes at the surface are essentially background. They're very low. There are other locations at the same site where we've got a different process going on. And we have to kind of figure out what this is. But we see this profile, and we have this at actually two different locations. Have this profile down the bottom of lead that's a little peculiar. And it really doesn't go down to background. And in this case, even 20, 30 centimeters from the surface, if it's not down at background, then we begin to see radon fluxes measured at the surface. We can see that they're increased. So this seems to be a good indicator of that radon is moving, you know, away from the waist and actually making it through the barrier. So one of the things that is controlling this kind of odd feature is moisture content. This is moisture content at that site. And so it is certainly has some influence. What's going on up here is maybe less clear. Maybe there are some preferential pathways down feeding moisture that's accumulating down here. But there's a couple different ways you can look at this. Clearly, it does not fit very well a diffusion coefficient. Brian, I put in I changed that model so that it, you know, looks nicer than the one I had before. Yep. But to do that, I had to increase the source term by a factor of 10. So we have some modeling work that we need to do to figure this out. So we see that average fluxes for all sites are below the 20 picocurie limit. Got to say that. But we do have a few locations where fluxes are substantially higher. There is a slight trend to higher fluxes compared to the as-built fluxes. And we also think we see that there's an awful lot of patchiness in these things on a scale of about 1 meter, suggesting that maybe there are degradation processes on that kind of small scale that we need to consider. But certainly, penetration by roots and by insects are associated with these elevated fluxes. And you do get very, very fine roots, at least, getting down into the radon barriers themselves. What that may mean for the long term is not quite clear to me. Maybe the most telling thing is that the hydraulic conductivity changes are almost linear with depth, showing substantial changes near the surface, and then going back to what we believe to be the more as-built values at depth. How are those going to change? Well, the analogs may give us an idea about that, because the analogs are pretty consistent with depth at values that suggest a lot of transport of water is possible through them. So is that what the end state of these going to be? We think maybe. And then it's good to be looking for different ways of monitoring these things. We think the LID 210 profiles are promising as a long-term radon flux indicator. And we're beginning to think about ways that that might be implemented as a monitoring method. So we're in the process of putting together a new Reg CR for this. We have a draft expected by spring, I hope. Over the summer, we held a workshop at NRC where we had over a day's worth of presentations of data from this site. And I'm putting together a conference proceedings on that, and that should be ready pretty soon. It should be available as a NRC conference proceedings on our website. And so now there's some consideration being given of possibility of a workshop for state regulators. We need to kick that around. And discussions are being held within NRC and with DOE about implications and possible recommendations for this work. So if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them.
All right, so any burning questions at this time? Otherwise, we're going to hold off until we have the panel discussion following 2 more presentations after lunch.
No
All right,
question.
guess everybody's hungry for now, so thank you, Mark,
Apparently
again.
so.
Plan for lunch.
Okay, for those participating in the catered lunch, we have a serving line in the kitchen. It's probably best to go through this back door. And you're welcome to bring your food back and eat in here. There's also the kitchen area, and we have an outdoor patio area. So wherever you'd like to situate is fine. So I think everybody's already paid at registration. Is that right?